Welcome to the Agent of Wealth podcast with Marc Bautis from Bautis Financial. In this podcast, Marc helps guide you towards financial freedom, ensure you never run out of money, and create a balance in life that prioritizes what is most important to you. Join us for this journey as Marc draws from years of expertise and guest experts to solve the multiple wealth building challenges involved in your financial life.
Welcome back to the Agent of Wealth. This is your host, Marc Bautis. Today I'm joined by a special guest, Elizabeth Husserl. Elizabeth is a registered investment advisor and co-founder of Peak 360, a boutique wealth planning firm. She expertly guides people to a deeper understanding of their relationship to money and wealth. In her debut book, The Power of Enough, Finding Joy in Your Relationship to Money, Elizabeth challenges us to rethink the way we approach wealth. Her work introduces the concept of embodied wealth, recognizing that true wealth isn't just about accumulating resources, but also about finding meaning, intimacy, and purpose in a relationship with money. Elizabeth, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on here.
Thank you, Marc. It's so good to be here.
So what inspired you to write The Power of Wealth and focus on the concept of embodied wealth?
So I've been sitting with these overlap between finance and economics. Like, that's my degree. I love numbers. I love solving problems, with psychology and spirituality, because that's, it's almost like I was raised by a doctor and a social worker therapist. So these are the two worlds that have inspired me. And I always knew that there was kind of a different approach to economics than what I was taught in my undergrad, right? I was taught that economics was the management of scarce resources. And something didn't quite sit right with that definition. I was like, wait a second, there has to be a different way for us to define economics, resources, and by consequence, wealth. And so I would say, Marc, that I've been on this journey since my, late teens, early 20s, that I've just been exploring these different concepts. And then when I did my time in Oaxaca after graduating from my economic degree and started really working with different communities and experiencing a different worldview and expression of wealth, I just knew that my work wasn't in these communities, but back in the States, where from my experience, people had a lot more, but weren't necessarily feeling as joyful and as wealthy and as fulfilled as some of the other, communities I had gotten the privilege of being with in the rest of the world. And so it's been a 20-year journey. And then I went into finance and financial advising and investment management, and really asking clients and peers and colleagues of what is our definition of enough? What's our definition of wealth? Why are we what are we investing for? And so always looking for that deeper why beneath what we're doing when it comes to financial planning and wealth management, and really feeling that I had something to contribute and add to my industry as a different perspective, where wealth is connected to well-being and an experience of fulfillment. And then from that perspective, helping people design a financial plan that encompassed other areas of wealth. I use a wealth mandala. There's other people, right? There's a new book that actually came out today that are talking about 5 different types of wealth. So there's something in our cultural conversation of wanting to define wealth differently. And so it felt very timely to add my voice to the conversation.
How do you define enough in the concept of financial success and personal fulfillment?
So enough, I can define enough, but I first have to take the step of helping people understand how do they define wealth, right? Because if we don't know what wealth is, we don't know what the goalposts and the barometers. So that's the first step, Marc. It's not defining enough in a vacuum, because that's what ends up happening, is that we think enough is a number, right? An asset size on our balance sheet. And the reality is that if you take a step back and you start seeing wealth with defined more broadly, and I'll use a tool that I call the wealth mandala, and it's basically a Sanskrit word for circle, and it's taking all the work that we've seen on human needs that Maslow did, that other economists have done, and it takes this idea that we have basic human needs that are universal, right? You and I, Marc, have common human needs, but the way that we satisfy them is unique and personal. And that's the key difference, because if we start looking at our wealth map and we have a sliver that is financial stability, that does require financial planning, that does have financial strategies that we apply to it, but we see these other aspects, right? It could be connection, participation, touch, belonging, understanding, a sense of safety, physical health, all these other areas, then we start to analyze how fulfilled do I feel in these other areas, or is there a sense of acute lack, which could be a different expression of poverty in these other areas? And then how do I start to develop strategies to have more fulfillment in them? And that's how you start to define enough, where if I can look at my wealth mandala and be like, I have resources and strategies and awareness in all the needs that are important to me, then I can start to feel that my life is more half full than half empty, right? And then we start to speak about what are the areas that you want to bring focus on, because maybe you might decide, you know what, in that particular need, I'm good at this level and I have enough there. But in this need, that acute sense of lack is really taking away from my sense of well-being, and I don't have enough, then what is it that would give you that experience of enough and that need? So do you see how it starts to get really specific and personal within a framework that can be universal, and it goes way beyond the numbers?
Yeah, I think that's like a common misconception you see a lot, is that whenever someone thinks financial planning or finance, they just think numbers, right? And there's always other aspects of it. And I think like the industry is starting to pick up on that, and you're starting to see more in different areas of it, and behavioral finance and emotions and how all those play into it. So yeah, I think it's definitely a topic that is definitely relevant now.
Yeah, I mean, I would say before your next question, there was two main books that inspired me in this conversation, right? Morgan Housel's The Psychology of Money and his work around the moving goalpost. And so really getting clear what that goalpost is. And then Die with Zero, which was this idea of memory dividends, right? That dividends around our experience and memories have tangible value, right? And so then I take those concepts and I talk about this ability to, so the power of enough. I didn't actually answer that question. The power of enough, right, is the ability to have an embodied sense of satiation, which is basically fulfillment. So when you take a moment in time, not just to be present and grateful, but to truly recognize when you feel satisfied. And the easiest way, Mark, to think about is that we all know what it feels like to have a meal that is really nutritious and satisfying versus eating something on the go and being like, wow, that was a bunch of empty calories. We all know what that feels like in our bodies. And so the same thing as we start to consume, right? Because consumption is a neutral act, but you start to consume certain things, certain experiences, which ones feels like they satisfy you to the core. And sometimes I tell people it's like that creative flow. Did time stop? And you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't even know that that went so fast, or it didn't matter how much I spent. I was in that flow with that experience, then taking the time to really consume it, be satiated by it, and let that compound, much like interest compounds in our portfolios. Let those experiences compound, because then you start to tell your body somatically and viscerally, oh, I know what enough feels like. And that is very different than only trying to map out enough on a spreadsheet or on a balance sheet. It's like, oh, I know what it feels like. And there's agency and power in that.
Yeah, I think Die with Zero, the concept of the memory dividend and how it compounds over time is that was one of my favorite books. And we actually did that. We do a book club at our company, and that was one that we did last year, and probably my favorite one of the past year that we did. It's great book, great concept.
Yeah.
It's like a kind of a new, refreshing topic that hasn't been covered before. What are some of the common misconceptions people have about wealth and the pursuit of more?
One of my favorites, Mark, and I love that we're kind of like in the similar industry, is like this idea that we call investment securities. Part of it's like, does anyone else hear that? Right? Like we put this misnomer that the more money I have, the more secure I feel. Right? And there's truth if I'm looking at my financial stability slice of the pie, right? More money can give me a sense of financial stability, but more money doesn't necessarily fulfill my need for connection or my need for belonging, right? It could potentially open doors to participate in different experiences. But if you're bought the ticket to the most expensive event and you didn't go and talk to anyone, that's not necessarily adding to your sense of belonging, participation, purpose, and connection. So there's a misnomer that money equals security. And we talk about it in our industry. We have the Securities Exchange Commission, right, that oversees all of our investments. And, it has a role, by all means, it has an important role. But I think that's a big misnomer that we need to start to separate. I think another misnomer is that money defines us, right? And so that money is a reflection of our trustworthiness or self-worth. I know I actively practice with my clients, Mark, when I'm reading through their e-money analysis and it says net worth at the top of the table, I say, what, let's call it asset size. Let's start to decouple the words net worth from self-worth, because in our culture, we bring those two together. And even if we're not actively saying it, often our experience of ourselves can be defined by how much money I have. And I feel like we're enslaved to that, and we need to create some spaciousness and break free.
I mean, you brought up like net worth and on a financial plan, and I think people are attached to it. Probably one of the reasons is it's measurable, and you can see kind of, okay, this is my net worth a year ago, this is it 5 years ago, this is it now. And then you mentioned there's other things that go into, your wealth, like connections or belonging. How can you kind of bridge that? Okay, you can measure a net worth. Is it just like you mentioned, they kind of, okay, I feel like I'm fulfilled in this area, or is there a way to measure those other aspects of wealth?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there's and again, Sahil Bloom talks about this. There's different scorecards, right? And so our balance sheet is one type of scorecard. And there's a way in which we can open up our aggregating app on our phone, see that our accounts went up, and we get that dopamine hit, right? So the wealth mandala, which is one of the tools that I talk about in the book, and there's a free resource on my website. Anyone can go and download it. You literally take that map down and you can color, you can put numbers. I mean, I've had clients just really take it and run with it. But on that map, you can clearly indicate on a level of 1 to 10, how fulfilled are you on these different types of wealth? And that's really important, right? And then I tell people, Mark, do an initial kind of like coloring of where you are. There's an example on my website so you can see like someone, dove deep, and C-suite client that I have dove deep. In some areas he was a 2. And in his financial stability, he's a 10, because guess what, right? He's financially independent. He's working just because he wants to. And then he's like, okay, is our work done? I'm like, our work is only half done. We've done a great level of organizing your financial stability and coming up with strategies to make sure that you understand you can quit when you want. But if you have some of these areas on your scorecard as a 2, and that is part of your experience of wealth, my job is half done if I don't start to help you understand what strategies and what resources we need to channel to these areas for you to continue to connect wealth to well-being. So that's a very easy way to measure it. You take that wealth mandala, you color it in, you see the areas that you feel strong in, and then you ask yourself, Mark, this is really important, in those areas that I'm feeling wealthy, what are the monetary and non-monetary strategies that I'm applying? And that's really important. If we only sit down and think of what are the monetary strategies that I'm putting towards that type of wealth, then we are still creating that dependency on money. But if you get super clear what are the non-monetary strategies that I'm using to fulfill that type of wealth, then you can start to bring some creativity of like, oh, I actually have I have kind of a healthy relationship to money where it can help me in some areas to fulfill it, but it doesn't have to be the one thing that I use to satisfy these needs. And so then you take that scoreboard or the wealth mandala, and then you start to look at those areas that feel more lacking, and you can start to bring some curiosity, some creativity to design with intentionality. How do you start to build more wealth in that area? And then you can say, okay, I started my year in a 2 here. What would it look like if I ended my year in a 5? What would it look like if I ended my year in the 10? What things need to happen? And you start to get a very clear map of how to add fulfillment, abundance, enoughness to that area that has most impact. Right? And so it's like the right use of resources in your particular life. And this is really important. Mark, I'll say one last thing. I'll let you ask a question. Is like, we talk about this all the time with my husband. I'm super relational. So a lot of my strategies have to do with creating interactions with other people. My husband is not, he's relational, obviously, like we're married and we have a super healthy marriage, but he's conceptual and ideas oriented. For him, having the ability to have more interaction around ideas is more important than creating meaningful connections. It's just different. And we have to learn not to judge that we're going to have the same satisfiers, but we can be each other's best friends in helping understand the difference of those satisfiers and making sure that our family life has space and our work life has space for all of them.
How does someone, so let's say they go through that exercise, right, and they find the areas where, and for lack of a better word, I'll call it lack, where they're lacking, and the wealth.
Yeah, there's poverty.
Yeah. How do they go, and, so they come up, okay, these are the areas I need to focus on. And I see the similar thing when someone comes up with a goal, right? Goals are great, but you need to figure out, what do I need to do, quarterly, monthly, weekly, daily? What habits or what practices do they need to embrace to be, how do they figure that out? That's where I see people a lot of times get stuck, where they might see, okay, yeah, I do have a deficiency in this area, or I think I could improve here, but then translating it and taking them, okay, with the next step to get, this is what you actually have to do at the most granular level to actually get to where you're trying to get to. What types of habits or practices could people embrace to help them get there?
So this is great. It's such an awesome question, because you're right. All of this is great conceptually. If we don't apply it, what's the point? And so what I would say is a couple things, is that when you do the wealth mandala, pick two things. Start to narrow your focus. And so I tell people, this is what I do with all my clients at the start of the year. So I'm in my Q1 reviews and we're doing the wealth mandala. We're picking two needs to work on. So from the 12 that I give you, pick two. Then go back to your spreadsheet, right? Or whatever you use for cash flow analysis and say, okay, what discretionary dollars do I have to put towards some of my needs? And I'm just going to use a number. Maybe you have $100 a month to work towards it, or $200 a month. Then see, okay, in my needs and in my strategies of monetary and non-monetary, right? How do I start to use this discretionary dollars to go towards those needs? And sometimes what's interesting here, Mark, is that when we put money to it, we can also kind of stay more accountable. I was going through this conversation with a client, and her need for this year is physical health. And she's like, I'm getting older and I feel like I'm losing muscle and stamina, and I want to go find a Pilates instructor. I'm like, great. Let's see how much money we have for that. Can you do one class a month, two classes a month? Let's use the numbers that we have, apply it to what you want. And if you sign up for those classes, then it starts to hold you accountable to actually, you've chosen to use money for that need satisfaction. So there's, how do we build that accountability too? And then what we did on the non-monetary is that she chose a friend in her life to become her accountability physical health buddy for the year. And they're going to hold each other accountable to making that goal be met, because she's like, I can say I'm going to do it and then I don't do it. And so let's use a non-monetary strategy, which is having a 10-minute check-in with a friend each week to hold each other accountable to meeting that need, right? And so if we start to proactively know how much we can spend, who are we going to lean on, what are the strategies I want to do, and we start to voice and get super granular with them, then you put it into practice and then give yourself those quarterly rebalances to be like, okay, let me go back to my wealth mandala after Q1. Am I still a 2? Did I inch up to a 3? Right? Am I at a 5? And you have these metrics to work with to kind of track your progress, right? And again, what I like about it is that it's really about, are you experiencing something different? Because if you start going to Pilates and you're like, I'm really still not feeling the strength and stamina, then shift your strategy, because it's less about meeting the Pilates goal. It's more about, am I feeling changes in my physical health? Right? And it's more of an exploration and a journey that is actually meant to be fun. And so I think that's the piece. The other thing that I would say that I think it's kind of more my unique contribution in the book is, so I introduced this concept around conversations with money, right? And so this idea that money can become, a friend, a guide, a board member, a colleague, whatever term you want to name it, whatever you feel comfortable with, but it is a relationship that we are in every single day of our life, Mark. And if we start to have a conversation with money, be like, okay, money, guess what we're doing this year, right? We're going to be focused on this need, or we're going to be focusing on how do I find that negotiation at work, or whatever it is that you want to. You start to have a different accountability buddy in your life by starting to have more awareness on this relationship in the conversation, right? And I can explain more how the conversation works, but there's so many tools that you can start to set up so it feels like you're not doing it in a vacuum, but you have a different support system, either with people you trust, your relationship with money, colleagues at work, etc. But when you start to have that support system, we feel like we're not doing it alone, and sometimes that can be the motivator in itself to make the change that we're looking for.
Yeah, I think the accountability aspect is great. But also there's this kind of little person on their shoulder, which we're going to say society or even social media, that's now you're not just looking at this yourself. You're not saying, okay, did I work out and am I starting to feel better? Now it's within the framework of what are you seeing other people doing and are you trying to keep up with them? How does that obsession with more from society impact like our mental and emotional health and well-being?
Oh my gosh. I mean, so much, right? Like the comparative game is a really hard one. And I think, again, one of the things I talk about in the book is that when we just determine what our metrics of success and wealth are from our mind center, our mind can go wild and our mind is naturally comparative and analytic and it has a role, right? But again, I really emphasize is that the invitation is to experience wealth, right? It's embody, it's what's in your felt feeling of it. And what feels good to you is not going to be the same thing that feels good to someone else. And again, you can have a buffet. Not everyone goes to the same thing. There's different kind of like taste buds. And so I think that's the piece where, so two things. You talked about there's this voice on our shoulders, right? Like I have a super strong inner critic. And what I love about starting to have a conversation with money is that like have money be this friend on your shoulder that you're having a conversation with where you get to really design what wealth and what success not only looks like, Mark, but feels like to you. And so when you're doing the wealth mandala, pause for a second and be like, okay, I'm a 2 in this category. It's not a vision board, right? Because I talk about this, like we get stuck in the scarcity abundance loop, right? And so I talk about this in the book. And what I mean by that is that we're trying to push scarcity away by bringing on more than enough, right? And notice like my hand, I'm grasping at that. Neither of these body positions is a relaxed one, right? No meditation teacher would say, hey, meditate pushing something away and holding really tight. That doesn't work, right? We have to learn how to kind of relax our body and know what that relaxation feels like in those different areas. And that may be hard at the beginning to be like, oh my God, I'm feeling really tight in this area. Hence, I'm saying it's a 2. It might be hard to be like, what does a 10 feel like? And so again, call on someone to be like, okay, can you lead me through a guided meditation to be like, what would it really look like to me if I felt satisfied in touch and purpose and belonging? Like for me, I know that my next iteration of stepping into my purpose is continuing to speak about this book and to have a keynote talk, right? And so where am I putting my resources this year is hiring a speaking coach because I feel comfortable, but there's so much I can learn. And so getting super clear those things that potentially feel scary, and I'm not saying do it today, but you have a sense of what that goalpost feels like. So that if you know what it feels like, you can tell your mind when you start scrolling social media and Instagram to be like, I need a mind break from all of this. Because guess what? I'm taking in too many images that aren't adding to my sense of wealth. So let me go back to the strategies I've already proactively identified and go back to doing one of those things so that I can start to cultivate that muscle. And I'll go back to what I said earlier. The more we learn how to compound moments of meaning and compound moments of fulfillment. Literally, I mean, swallow. When you have a meaningful, I mean, to me, it's meaningful conversation. So every time I do a podcast interview, I love them. I will take 5 minutes before jumping on email and really give myself the moment to digest and integrate what that was. And the more I let my body know what fulfillment is, the faster I'll go back to it when I'm thrown off, right? When disappointment comes my way or when anxiety comes my way, I'll be like, okay, let me move through these emotions because I know my way back to what fulfillment feels like. And it did not matter if my account went up or down.
I'm a big proponent of financial literacy. And kids, they either learn their financial habits from school or from their family, from their parents. And I think just now schools are starting to get better, but they're teaching things like budgeting and saving and investing. How can we raise our kids with some of these principles you talk about in the book of fulfillment and enough and wealth? How do we teach kids younger instead of, waiting until they're adults and maybe there is some kind of issue that's generating or initiating it?
Yeah. 100%. I love this question. I'm a parent myself. I have a 14-year-old, right? So I've been in this conversation with my daughter for years now. And I think one of the best examples, because I ask her, I'm like, Michelle, what have been, that's her name. What are some of the main lessons that we've gotten from our journey together? And she's like, you know what, Mom, one of the most important things that I taught her that we did together is that we would go into Target. She loves Target, right? Or basically any big box store. Kids are like, it's like a candy store. And I think the first thing to notice is that when a kid walks into a store, to let them experience that sense of like curiosity and creativity and innovation, because they're like, ooh, so much at my fingertips, right? And I know as a parent, you can kind of walk in with a little bit of dread. You're like, oh my God, I have to just be telling them no. And so no, a lot of times I'd go into Target and be like, okay, Michelle, I'm going to go do the food shopping that you don't want to do. You go browse and just go browse. And she would love to have 20 minutes just walking down the aisles looking at stuff. And then I'd go find her in the toy department and she'd be like, ooh, Mom, look what I found. I'm like, great. And so notice the difference. I'm coming at it with like neutral, great. And she'd be like, can I buy this? I'm like, so I ask her a couple questions, Mark. I say, would you use your own money? Right? That's the first filter. And she would kind of take a minute and be like, no, I wouldn't use my own money. I'm like, okay, great. Then why would I use my money for it? Right? And so that was always the first filter. Would you use your own money? And if she said no, it went on back to the shelf. So cool that you got to hang out with it for 5 minutes. If she said, yes, I would use my own money, I'm like, great, let's check your allowance app. What do you have? And we would look at our allowance app and it'd be like, you have $30 and this costs $20. Would you use 70% of it? And she'd be like, no. I'm like, okay, great. Goes back on the shelf. Or let's save for it, right? And if she said, yes, I would use almost all my allowance for it. I'm like, great, let's buy it. And my job as a parent, unless she's buying something that's going to cause her harm, is to say in a non-judgmental way, let's buy that toy, right? Because you went through all these different filters and I'm teaching you to track internally what that purchase feels like. Right? So do you notice kind of taking her through that? And if she would come back and be like, you know what, Mom, I really want this, but I don't have enough money. So let's start saving towards it. I'm like, great, let's come up. How many weeks do we need to save? And then 4 weeks would pass. And I'd be like, does that item still sing to you? Right? My mom taught me this. In Spanish, we would say, te hace cosquillas. Does it tickle you? And I'm like, does it still sing to you? And sometimes you say, yes, let's go get it. And sometimes you'd be like, no, not thinking about it anymore. And so that kind of like, it's not delayed gratification. That's important, but it's kind of helping her from a non-judgmental way start to pay attention to what she's attracted to in the material world, how to decide around cost and value based on what she has, whose money she's going to spend, and then how to understand if she's buying it, right? Then how do we also really kind of like obtain meaning from it, making sure she's using it, asking her the next day, how was that new item? Or if it was a piece of clothing, how did it feel, right? Like really engaging. And so you take one item and it just has multiple layers of interaction. And if we did that as adults, right, we kind of like that whole quality over quantity, we would go through our rooms and be like, what are the objects I'm really engaging with? Freaking awesome. Which are the ones that are collecting dust? Let's pass them on, right? It would be a different way that we would engage with the world. And I think that's really important because you start to give them that internal barometer of how to engage with the material world they're in.
I find when it comes to like financial planning or anything with finances, the hardest thing for people is to get started. Just for a multitude of reasons. But is there one action that you'd encourage the listeners here to take after hearing this conversation that could help them get started on this?
Yeah. Well, you're totally right, Mark. And I don't know, from your experience, from my experience, people don't want to get started because they're afraid of what they're going to find.
Yep.
Right? And that's why they walk into the office. They're like, okay, I'm afraid of what I'm going to find. Can someone help me? And sometimes it is easier to do it when you're with someone else. And so, a lot of times, I wrote this book partly to encourage people to find another way to have conversations about money that didn't necessarily require going to the numbers first, right? Because I think that's really important. If you're overwhelmed by sitting down and looking at what's coming in and what's going out, take a second, do one of the exercises in the book. There are free resources on my website as well. Do the wealth mandala, because then if you're like, okay, I'm clear on where I want to channel resources, then the why, behind the spreadsheet becomes more apparent, right? Because if we're going to start channeling resources, some discretionary resources to some of these areas, you got to know what those discretionary resources are. And some people are like, oh my gosh, I don't want to do that exercise because I'm going to find out that I don't have any discretionary resources. And they're like, okay, but at least you start to see if that's the case because you're paying off debt or you have a college loan or whatever you have, then potentially the timeline of paying that off has a clear connection to the why. Because I find, Mark, that people sometimes get stuck in the paralysis of taking a step because they don't know the why behind it, or they're not excited by the why. They're told you should be financial literate, or you should be adulting with money. Paying bills feels like a chore. Paying taxes feels like a chore. But if I'm able to help them connect, or they're able to connect to the why that brings joy and fulfillment, and I chose that subtitle consciously, finding joy in your relationship to money, then we can turn back to the spreadsheet and be like, okay, maybe I'm not quite finding joy there, but I know where my joy is. So I'm going to do the spreadsheet analysis because I do want to understand how I can find more agency and choice in how I deploy my resources.
Yeah, it makes sense. All right, Elizabeth, that's all the questions I have for you today. I want to thank you for joining me on today's episode. Before we go, how best can our listeners find out more about what you do and get a copy of your book?
So I have a website, elizabethhusserl.com. My last name is Husserl. You can find links to buying the books or wherever you buy books. And you can also find a bunch of just free resources that complement the book, and you can get started on it today.
Great. We'll link to all that in the resources section of the show notes. Thanks again, Elizabeth, and thank you to everyone who tuned in today. Don't forget to follow the Agent of Wealth on the platform you listen from and leave us a review of the show. We're currently accepting new clients, and if you'd like to schedule a one-on-one consultation with our advisors, please do so at bautisfinancial.com/call.
Thank you for listening to the Agent of Wealth podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered represents the views and opinions of the guests and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Bautis Financial. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to be a substitute for professional financial planning and investment advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investments and financial planning.